I'm going to college. I thought I was a good enough football player that I could play for Notre Dame. But the problem I had was that, number one, I didn't get a scholarship from Notre Dame. Number two, I went to a small teacher's, I waited too long to register at Notre Dame. I went to a small teacher's college my first year called Wayne State. And I remember I went out for football, and I weighed 140 pounds, and the first football practice we had, I started to change my mind about playing college football. Like the second day, I became a little more convinced that I wasn't good enough to play college football. And about the third day, I was knocked on my ass so hard, I decided that I'd go out for the cheerleading squad. And fortunately, I didn't have to make a tough decision because I was invited to join the cheerleading group at that school, which we called the Cats Club, K-A-T-Z. And they were a hell-raising bunch of kids that weren't good enough to play football, but loved football and loved cheerleading, and we had absolutely great parties. So anyway, I went to Wayne State the first year and was kind of a big man on the campus for a freshman at that school. But I wanted to go then to the University of Nebraska because I still thought I might be a walk-on at Nebraska. But I got to Nebraska and I couldn't even get a uniform small enough to fit me, and I could see those guys, there was no way. There was one thing about football I didn't like, and that was being hit. I didn't mind as long as nobody hit me. I didn't mind running around looking, good in a uniform. But boy, I hated to be hit by some of those big guys. And they really were, they would really hit you. I worked my way through college. My mother, who from her work as a telephone operator had saved her money and had made some good investments, paid my tuition, and always gave us a checkbook and said, now, here's the checkbook, you have the checkbook, but please think twice before you write a check. And I never did write a check while I was there. I had the access to a checking account, but I felt that I could do it on my own. And I had mostly food work, waiting on tables at the student union for my meals and doing work at a boarding house or a house where I had a room. But I did not participate to any great extent in anything at the University of Nebraska, with the exception of working. And I joined a fraternity, but I was a pledge, but I never did join because I didn't have the money. I didn't want to spend my mother's money to pay the initiation fee. And I always hung around the fraternity house. And my brother came down to school, and he joined the fraternity, and he paid the fee to get in. He was a member, and I wasn't a member. But one thing I participated in at Nebraska was rodeo. Ohio State, I read the other day, has something like 40 or 50 sports you can letter in. But they didn't have, there's one thing you could letter in at Nebraska you couldn't letter in at Ohio State, and that was rodeo. And one of my close friends' name was Tex Buell. Tex came from a big ranch out in western Nebraska. He was a real cowboy. Big, tall guy, wore cowboy boots to school. And he and I were on the roping team and the bulldogging team, and we lettered in rodeo, but that was the only sport that I participated in to any extent at the University of Nebraska. So I was basically working and studying, and when I graduated, I couldn't get a job. It was in the Depression, and I was interviewed by several companies, and they had a first choice and a second choice and a third choice, and if the first choice didn't accept their job, they go to the second and so forth. And I was second choice on a couple of good companies, but I didn't get a job with any major company. But one of the very good friends of my mother in Ewing, her oldest son went to law school at Creighton University and graduated and became an executive with an outfit called Jewel Tea Company. So I called him and I told him I couldn't get a job, and it was in the summer of 1940, and I needed a job. And he said, well, we can put you on a sales crew and send you out to Oklahoma. And I said, what do they do? Well, they said they go door to door and try to sell Jewel tea products. So I said, boy, I'll take it, anything. So I went to training, and what we did, there was a cooking device called pressure cookers that were just coming new on the market. And they were a pan about that big around, about that deep, and put the lid on and cinched it down, and you'd get the pressure up, and you put the little thing on top, and it'd wiggle while you cooked, and then everything cooked. And the benefit of those things was that it kept all the good ingredients in the food. They didn't escape through boiling and then pour out the water and so forth. And so I went on a sales crew out in Oklahoma the summer of 1940. And baby, I'll tell you, there's no tougher job in the world than door-to-door selling. Cold calls, going up and knocking on the door. You don't know who, if anybody's coming to the door. You don't know whether they're going to be receptive or whether they're going to tell you, get your butt off my porch, what are you doing here? You woke me up, you're disturbing me, I'm going to call the police, blah, blah, blah. It was tough. But there's no better way to learn to sell than selling blind, door to door. Anyway, the first sale I made, and the deal was with these pressure cookers, we gave the pressure cooker to the customer at no cost, and they had a coupon book with the pressure cooker. And then as they bought from the Jewel tea man who stopped by once a week or 3 times a month or whatever, as they bought different products, coffee, tea, all the different products that Jewel tea had, they tore a coupon out, and after they tore out X number of coupons, the pressure cooker became yours. And I don't know how many people would have moved and taken the pressure cooker with them before that, but anyway, that wasn't my problem. My problem was simply to get them to sign the contract and put the pressure cooker in their house. So one of the calls I made was to a parsonage where a priest, it was a Catholic parsonage. I knock on the door, the housekeeper comes to the door, and she said, yes, what can I do for you? And I said, I'm selling pressure cookers. She said, you're selling what? And I said, I'm selling pressure cookers. And I explained the concept to her. She said, well, we're not interested in anything like that. About that time, I could hear the priest say, who is it, Maggie? And she said, some guy out here trying to sell us pressure cooker. And he said, what's a pressure cooker? And she said, you won't believe what this guy says they'll do. And he said, well, bring him in. I'd like to hear him say what they'll do. So I go in. First thing I said, Father, I almost became a priest. And then I explained to him, oh, son, that was wonderful. I hope you didn't make a mistake. And he said, now, how do you happen to be doing this? And I said, well, I couldn't get a regular job, and I'm out here selling these things door to door. And he said, well, explain the concept to me. So I explained to him. And he turned and said, Maggie, this seems to me like a very healthful thing. I think that'd be good for me, don't you? Well, Father, you know, I cook mulligan stew, and you know, I know you do all that, but this saves all the good ingredients. Yes, sir, we'll take one of those, see? So that was my first sale, and I'll never forget it. I went to, we went out into the country in attempts to, not only in the town, but we were selling them out in the country. And I go to this one house, and the old rancher is sitting on his back porch. It's about 10 o'clock in the morning. And I tell him what I'm doing. And he said, well, that sounds kind of interesting. He said, you see that oil well pumping out there? And I said, yeah. And he said, you see that rocker arm? And I said, yeah. The rocker arm is the pump on the oil well. And it goes like this. It's a huge thing, probably 30 feet long and probably 3 feet wide. It has a pump on the end of it. And there's an engine that runs this thing, and there's a downstroke, and then it pulls the oil out, and then down and pulls. And as it pulls it out, it pumps it into a pipeline and so forth. And on the end of that rocker arm, I saw a keg. He had a keg tied on there, wooden keg. And he said, you see that keg on there? And I said, yeah. He said, I'm aging whiskey. I said, what do you mean aging whiskey? He said, well, when the whiskey is made in Europe, Scotch whiskey is made in Europe or wherever, and he said, they bring it to this country and they put it on a ship, and all the way over here in those wooden kegs, that whiskey's rocking with the ship. And he said that increases the aging process by about 50%. So he says, I'm doing the same thing. I got this thing tied on the end of that rocker arm, and he says, I'm aging that whiskey. And I said, where do you get that whiskey? He said, a buddy of mine makes it, and then we sell it. Of course, they were bootleg. But he was aging his whiskey. He said, would you like to try a little? And I said, yeah, geez, I don't know. I got calls to make. No, I said, I'll tell you what I'll do. He said, if you'll try my whiskey, I'll try your pressure cooker. I said, fine. So he goes to a well, a dug well, pulls on the rope, and he's got a keg down in this well where it's cool. He gives me a glass, and he has a glass, and we pour it out of it. And it's white, it's pure white, 110 alcohol. We go sit in the porch in the rocking chair, and I'm watching that oil well rocking out there, and I'm drinking that white stuff. I think I spent almost the whole day there before I could get off the premises. But that was one of the many selling experiences, and I've never regretted that job. As a matter of fact, I've never regretted a job that I had because it was too difficult or too tough or I didn't like the people. I never quit a job for reasons that of personalities or difficulty or the hours or anything like that, because I felt that it was good discipline, and I was learning in a learning process. I always looked on every job as a learning process. But that kind of, in Nebraska, of course, in those days, as always, Nebraska had great football teams, and my roommate played end for Nebraska. His name was Ray Prohaska, and Nebraska went to the Rose Bowl January 1, 1941. And as I told you, I had difficulty getting a job that summer of 1940, so I enlisted in the Air Force. And I was to report to Oxnard, California, January 2, 1941, for primary training. And Nebraska was going to Pasadena, California, which was about, Oxnard was about about 75 miles up the road from Pasadena. So I went out with the football team with Ray Prohaska. I had a ticket on the 50-yard line and so forth, and watched Nebraska get beat by Stanford. Stanford had a left-handed quarterback named Frankie Albers, and he just drove that Nebraska team crazy because he was passing from a different side than they'd ever seen a guy pass before. Anyway, Nebraska lost, but I reported to the Air Force on January 2, 1941. I took my basic at Oxnard. That lasted, I think basic lasted 3 months. Then I took basic. I took primary at Oxnard. I took basic at Moffett Field. And when we finished our training in those days, you could resign your commission to go with the Canadian Air Force. And there was a fellow by the name of Clayton Knight, who'd been a World War I ace from Canada, who had started a fund in Canada that had become very successful in recruiting American pilots to come up to Canada. And we're in a bar one night in Los Angeles, and we're sitting at the bar, and this guy came up and he said, "You guys cadets?" And we said, "Yeah." He said, "Did you ever hear the Clayton Knight Committee?" I'd never heard of it. So he explained what it was. Well, it turned out that he told us that we could get out of the Army Air Corps if we came to Canada. And he said, the advantages are numerous. First of all, we'll pay you 15 cents a mile travel from Los Angeles to Ottawa, Ontario. And there were 3 of us there, Larry Hickey and Jack Ledyard and myself. And we said, "You mean each of us will get 15 cents?" He said, "Yeah." I said, 45 cents a mile from Los Angeles to Ottawa. He said, "That's right." So we said, "Well, we'll think it over and let you know." Billy said, "Meet me here next week." Well, it's Saturday night. So we talked it over, and you had to have 500 hours, and we had about 125. But we decided that we could take logbooks and go around to airports and write down the numbers off the tail of airplanes put down 3 hours in that airplane, and so that our logbooks would look like they were aging. We'd throw them on the floor, kick them around. So we took you had to buy new logbooks. Anyway, we filled it in with numbers off to authenticize the thing, and to make the books look like they were old. I remember we'd throw them on cement, or we'd kick them along, walk on top of them, and so forth to get them beat up. And we ultimately showed them to this guy, and he said, "Oh shit, you guys are prime." He said, "No question about it." And we said, "Well, do you give us an advance, or how do you pay?" He said, "We pay you 3 times on your way to Ottawa." And he said, "Yeah, I don't think there's any problem that you can fly our airplanes up there." So we have, "What do you do?" "Well, your ferry planes around and so forth." So anyway, when we went to Canada, we were making 45 cents a mile. We bought a used car in Los Angeles. We had the car paid for by the time we got to Las Vegas. We had so much money we didn't know. 45 cents a mile in those days was a lot of money. We get to Ottawa. We check in with the RCAF. We were billeted at the Chateau Laurier, which was one of the world-class hotels. The house band, the band that played every night at the Chateau Laurier, was Guy Lombardo. I mean, that's the kind of a place it was. And I remember one day we walked out of the hotel, and the governor of Nebraska was having a tour outside the hotel, and I don't remember how somebody pointed out to me that was the governor of Nebraska. So I walked up to the governor and introduced myself, told him I was from Ewing, Nebraska. Of course, he knew where Ewing was. He wrote down my mother and dad's name, and he said, "Well, I think this is fantastic." He said, "You guys are showing patriotism above and beyond." He said, "There's no question we're going to get into it." And he said, "I think this is your just blah, 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 blah." So he got back to Lincoln, wrote a letter to my mother and dad, said that he had seen your very brave son up at Ottawa, and he was with the RCF. Anyway, the damn Draft Act came along and was passed, and we hadn't registered for the draft. We were in Canada on visitors' visas, and those would not qualify to keep us out of registering for the draft. So we had to come back. You couldn't register by mail. You had to come back and personally register and take a physical exam, see if you're going to be 4 or F or whatever you're going to be. So we took a leave, got in our car, the 3 of us, and on the way back, we got to thinking the Battle of Britain was at its peak, and a number of the guys in the RCAF were being sent to Britain to fly Spitfires, and Spitfires were a hell of an airplane, which was far beyond our ability, and we knew it. And we knew we could no longer fake our ability to fly. And we knew that if we stayed up there, we were going to be sent to England for the Battle of Britain. So Hickey says, "I'm not going back." And Ledyard said, "Well, what do you think? We kind of got a contract with them." He says, "I don't give a shit if we got a contract or not. I'm not going back, because if we go back, we're going to Europe." And I said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And he said, "I'm going to go back in the Air Force. I'm going to re-enlist in the Air Force." And Ledyard said, "Boy, that doesn't sound like a bad idea. I don't think I'll go back either." I said, "Well, what are you going to do?" "Well, I'll become a civilian instructor." He said, "Back in Oxnard, California, teaching primary." He said, "Those guys are making good money." He said, "I don't think there's any question I can get a job." And I said, "Well, if you guys aren't going, I'm not going back." He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I think I'm going to try and get in the Navy." He said, "Okay." So we went to Omaha. Hickey lived in Omaha, and I lived in Nebraska, so we could both register together. Ledyard was from Kansas, so he had to go to Kansas City or something. Anyway, we didn't go back. And as it turned out, had we stayed in the Air Force, we would have been taken prisoner at Corregidor, because our class were flying out of the Philippines when the Japs took over the Philippine Island. And as near as we could tell, and watching names of the prisoners and so forth, I found the names of several of my classmates that were in the Bataan Death March, and those guys ultimately, of course, they'd been in Corregidor and so forth. So that was the luckiest thing that happened in that respect. Secondly, we were lucky that we didn't go back to Canada because the attrition rate was so heavy on these Canadians that were in the Battle of Britain. It was unbelievable. So the whole thing turned out real well for us. And it turned out particularly well for me because I had a non-flying status in the Navy. I couldn't fly off carriers and take all that training, but they had a special category that they were sending a select group of 60 guys. I was at the Naval Air Station in Norfolk. They picked 60 guys who had had previous flight experience to go up to Ohio State University and take a 90-day course in aircraft recognition. At that period of time during the war, we were shooting down more of our own planes than the Japs or the Germans were, because the guys in the trenches, anything that flew over, they didn't take a chance. They didn't know one plane from another, and they just opened up on them. So we were having a terrible time with friendly fire. They sent us up to Ohio State to learn how to identify every aircraft and ship that was in the war. Japan, American, German, all of them. Because at the time we were taking the course, they hadn't assigned us to any particular theater, whether it was a European theater, and that was a mistake, one of the primary mistakes, because they could have trained us faster had we known we were going to the Pacific, just training us on Jap planes and so forth. So I had volunteered for submarine duty also back. Fortunately, I didn't get there. But I got this recognition course, and I went to the Pacific and went from immediately to Guadalcanal into the heart of the fighting. But I'm at Ohio State, and we had taken over a female dormitory. They had evacuated the girls from this dormitory and turned it over to the Navy, to 90 Navy guys, and we were billeted in this girls' dormitory, and we marched across the quadrangle over to another building on the other side where the course that we were taking was being taught. And we'd march over there every morning at 8 o'clock. We'd march back at 11:30. We'd march back over at 1. We'd march back at 3 or whatever it was. And the draft act, as I said, had taken place, and most of the guys that were drafted or were in the service, the place was loaded with co-eds. The average must have been like 10-to-1 women to guys. And every time we marched, the gals were out there clapping and watching us, and we were particularly attractive to them because we were the first naval officers in our summer whites with the high collar and the shoulder board and our hats squared away, and the gals just thought we were the greatest thing. And we were down at the Neal House at a Wednesday afternoon tea dance. We were down there at the Deschler Wallach in the ballroom, just dancing ourselves to death with those wonderful guys, or gals. So I had a date with a Chi Omega, and I forget her name, and my buddy who had a car there with him, his name was Fred Jones, and he said, can you get me a date, do you think? And I said, well, let me call this gal I'm dating, her name was Betty something, and see if she has a friend that'll come along. So I called her, she said, oh yeah, I said, I've got just the girl for him. He said, well, it was Mary Jane. So when we picked him up, his date was Mary Jane, and my date was the gal I'd been going with him. So we get down to Deschler, or where the dance was, and about halfway through, I leaned over to him and I said, do you mind switching dates? And he said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, your date lives in town, and she doesn't have to be in by 11 o'clock. My date is in the Chi Omega sorority house, and she has to be back by 11 o'clock. And I said, plus, your date is a better dancer than my date, and you're not that crazy about dancing anyway. So I said, what do we say? Ah, that's good, we'll switch. He said, we'll switch. So we switched dates, and I got Mary Jane. And from that time on, while I was there, I dated Mary Jane. And just loved her. I mean, she was one of the most beautiful co-eds on the campus. And her parents lived there, and her dad had a car, and she was usually driving his car to school, and so I had transportation and the best looking girl on the campus. So our 90 days are over, and we're finished up with our courses, and we're shipped back to Norfolk. So about the second week that we're back in Norfolk, we're sitting in the officers club, and a couple of the guys that I was with had taken the course, and they said, "Hey, why don't we call those girls, some of those girls in Columbus, and see if they'll come down here for a weekend?" And I said, "Well, who do you have in mind?" And they said, "Well, Mary Jane's kind of the ringleader of those girls. Why don't you call her and ask her if she can get 5 of her girlfriends?" He said, "The railroad runs from Columbus, Ohio, through, I forget the name of the town in Virginia. It wasn't Norfolk, it was a town north of there, whatever it was. And tell them that we'll meet the train, to come down on the train. We'll meet them there, come back down here. We'll have a big party over the weekend. They can go back on Sunday." And so I called Mary Jane and I said, "You want to hear something crazy?" I said, "These guys think you could get a half a dozen of the gals together and come down for a big party." I said, "We'll have a suite and so forth and blah, 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 blah." I said, "What do you think about it?" She said, "I think it's a great idea." So I said, "How long will it take you to find out?" This is like about 7:30 at night. She said, I ought to have them rounded up by 10:30. I said, "You mean tonight?" She said, "I'll call you back at 10:30. Where are you?" I said, "Well, we're in the officers club," and I gave her the number. So I said, "Hey guys, this thing is shaping up real good." So 10:30 she calls back. She says, "You won't believe it." She says, "I got them." I said, "Who'd you get?" I'm writing it down. I said, "I knew them all." I said, "Great, that's fantastic." I said, We'll send you a check for the railroad fare so it doesn't cost you anything." And I said, "You come down Friday evening, Friday afternoon, whatever, when you get out of school, and you go back Sunday afternoon in time to pick up school on Monday." She said, "Fine, we'll be there." I said, "Okay, we'll meet you at the railroad station at such and such thing." Well, one of the guys had a convertible, and we all half dozen guys piled in this convertible, go up to this town, whatever it was, and we rented a suite, had a big party, had a bunch of beer up there, had a hell of a party. And Sunday afternoon, about 2 or 3 hours before they were ready to go back, Mary Jane said, "Come here, I want to talk to you." She said, "Don't tell anybody this." And I said, "Don't tell anybody what?" Well, she said, "If you can talk the rest of the guys into letting Betty Van Steenberg, no, Betty Hoy." She said, "Betty Hoy ride back with you." She said, "She and Van Steenberg want to get married." And I said, "Chris, we already got 6 in that convertible." I said, "I don't think these guys will buy that." "Well, they're over there now, Van Steenberg, they're talking to, and they're serious." So I go over to a couple of guys. "What do you think about Betty Hoy riding back because Van Steenberg wants to get married?" "Well, yeah, we can crowd her in." So I go back to Mary Jane and I said, "Tell them that she's all set." And I said, "This is the dumbest thing I ever heard anybody do it." I said, "Instead of her going to school, she's going to ride back to Norfolk with us, and they're going to get married." She said, "Yeah." She said, "I don't think it's such a dumb idea." I said, "You don't think it's a dumb idea? I think it's the stupidest thing anybody could do." So we chatted for about a half an hour. The next thing I know, we had agreed that she'd ride back too, because she wanted to be the bridesmaid for Betty, and then she and I would get married. So I would stand up for them, and then they would stand up for us. So we called her dad and told him that she wasn't going to be on the train. She wasn't coming back. That she was getting. No, we didn't call it. We sent him a telegram, and we said we had to stay within 10 words because it was cheaper. We had something like, "After thinking it over, we've decided to get married." And I think that was 10 words, and we sent that message. Well, they were furious. She's their only girl, a little Mary Jane, junior in college. This is, the shit hit the fan. But the shit really didn't hit the fan. We get Mary Jane and we get Betty in there. Now we got like 8 people crowded in this little convertible. We're stacked all over each other in the back seat, in the front seat. It was something else. We get back to Norfolk about 8 o'clock at night on Sunday night. And Norfolk in those days You look out any window and it's just a sea of white. Sailor caps. Just literally hundreds of thousands of sailors down there walking the streets and so forth. So we go to the main hotel and I go up to the desk and I said, we'd like to rent a room for a couple of days. And he starts to laugh. I said, what are you laughing at? He said, we haven't had a room in this hotel for 2 years. I said, what are you talking? No, he said, these sailors rent the rooms by the month. He said, just so they could have the rooms available on their leave, on the weekend and so forth. And I said, oh, you don't have a thing? I don't have a thing. I said, would there be any point in you call other hotels? He said, it's the same thing. You're not going to find a hotel room in Norfolk, Virginia, in just like the end of, it was before May. It was about the 28th of May. He said, you're not going to find a room in this town, no matter what. So Van Steenberg and the two gals were standing there in the lobby when I walked back. And I said, hey, we were in real trouble. I said, looks like these girls are going to have to sleep in the car or something. I said, I don't think we planned this well enough. He said, what? I said, hell, there's not a hotel room available in this town. It hasn't been for a couple of years. So we're sitting there trying to figure out what are we going to do. By this time it's like 11:30 at night or midnight. What are we going to do? Well, I'm kind of out of the corner of my eye looking at the elevator, and I see a chief petty officer getting off whom I knew, and he's kind of flipping the key in the air as he's walking over toward the deck. And man, I made a beeline for him. And I said, do you have a room here? And he said, yeah. I said, I rent the thing by the month. I said, what are you doing with it for the next couple of days? He said, nothing. I'm saving it for the weekend. I said, geez, can I rent it from you for the next? Well, he said, you can have it. So I grabbed the key, and we put the girls up, and we went back to the base and checked in, and we thought we'd get married the next day. Well, we check, and it's got a 3-day waiting period in Virginia before you can get married. You have to have a blood test and all that kind of stuff. So that delayed our plans, but we finally got the marriage license, and we were married, I think, as I remembered, on Wednesday. And the gals had stayed in that hotel. But we stood up for them, and then they stood up for us, and we were married at the officers' club, and they got the swords, and all the guys were turning out and whacking away. So anyway, now we got no place to stay. We got one hotel room. We got two couples on a honeymoon, and that ain't going to be any good. Plus, the chief got a hold of me and he said, I got to have that room. I said, why? He said, I got to leave on Thursday. He said, can you get those gals out of there by? I said, yeah, anytime you want it. It's your room. I said, this is ridiculous. So we got to get out of the room. Well, we find a room for rent in the want ads. One room. We go and look at it. It's on the second floor of this little house. But there's an airing porch, like out here, only about half the size. But that airing porch was the same size as a mattress on a bed. So we rented the room for our honeymoon, and we flipped to see who got the bed and the springs and who got the mattress. And I won. And there's no air conditioning in Norfolk, Virginia at that time. It's June 1st, and it is hotter than hell. I flip and I win. I get the mattress. I drag the mattress off that bed out onto that airing porch. Mary Jane and I are sleeping outside on that mattress. Van Steenberg got the springs on the bed. He covered the springs with a couple of blankets. That's where we spent our honeymoon. So then, about 3 days later, I get my orders. Proceed and report first available transportation, Guadalcanal. So I had, at the time, I think I had about $50 in pay that I could draw, something like that. So I told Mary Jane, I said, we'll go back to Columbus on this railroad, and you get off there and go back to school, finish your school, and then when I come back from Guadalcanal, I'll get you can stay with your folks, just like you've been staying, just like I've never been there. So she said, okay. So we get on the train, we buy 2 tickets, go to Columbus, Ohio. I've got a couple of weeks delay en route, and I got my orders. We took the train from Norfolk to Columbus. I took part of my leave in Columbus. As a matter of fact, I took it all. And when the day arrived for me to get on board the train and go to San Francisco on my way to Guadalcanal, Mary Jane borrowed her dad's car and took me down to the station. And I had a Pullman, upper berth in a Pullman, as officers did. I had an upper berth in the Pullman. Mary Jane says, I'll never forget the words as long as I live, "I've never been in a Pullman. What are they like?" And I said, "I don't know. I've never been in a Pullman either." Well, she said, "They're making up the train. It doesn't leave for 10 minutes. She said, let's jump on and find out where your berth is. I'd like to see what a Pullman's like." I said, "Okay." So we get on the Pullman. We find my upper berth. Mary Jane says, "Boost me up. I'd like to see how comfortable it is." I boost her up into this upper berth. We had been married like 3 days, 4 days. She said, "Jump up here. I think two people can maneuver up here." I said, "I don't see how two people..." Well, she says, "Shut up and get up here." I climbed up there, and two could, but it was a little cozy, a little tight. And one thing led to another, and the next thing I know, the damn train is underway, and I've got one ticket. So I said, "Okay, smarty, what are we going to do now?" I said, "I think they'll probably stop the train and throw us off, and we'll have to walk clear back to the station." She said, "No, they're not." She said, "The Lord will prevail." Well, I said, "I don't know whether the Lord will prevail in this situation or not." But about that time, I could hear the porter coming through the, "Tickets, please, tickets, please." Well, we had the blinds closed on this upper berth. So when he got to us, I just stuck my hand out with my ticket, and he punched it and went on his way. He didn't know there were two people up there. So I said, "Okay, it looks like we're safe for tonight." But I said, "I don't know how in the world we're going to handle this in the morning." She said, "The Lord will prevail." So it comes morning. She has to go to the bathroom. I have to go to the bathroom. And I said, "The only way you can go to the bathroom is for me to find out where the porter is. And when he's at the other end of this car, you jump out and run in and get back up here by the time he gets here." So she did, and it worked. And about that time, I got out, and the porter's coming. And I said, "Porter, I'm feeling mighty poorly today." I said, "Is there any way you could not make up this berth for today?" "Oh, sir, yeah." I said, "Well, I don't need to make up today. You feel poorly?" He said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to San Francisco, and I'm going to war." "Oh, you just stay up there as long as you want to. You going to war? You ain't never going to get back in a Pullman car. You just stay up there." So there we are up there again. And while I was talking to him, I gave him the ticket, and he punched it. I crawled back up there. We're up there till evening. Comes Sam, "Tickets." He's coming through, "Tickets." I stick my hand out there again. In the meantime, I'm going to the dining car and having a nice dinner, and I'm bringing Mary Jane back hard rolls, throwing them up to her in the thing. I could get her water, so she's living on hard rolls and water. The second day, we're in Omaha, someplace like that. I jump off and run in the depot, and it's, "How much is a one-way ticket to San Francisco?" Well, the amount was more than I had. I think I had $42 less, something like that, more than I had. So I get back on it. I said, "Another night on this thing. Tell the porter, don't make up the bed. Tickets, please." One hand out the door, click, back in that thing. Hard rolls. "Don't make up the bed. Hard rolls." Next day, we're like Denver or Reno or something. I run in. "How much is a one-way ticket?" "Too much. I don't have the money." Back on the train. Another day, another night on this train. Crawl back up there. Hard rolls. Punch the ticket. On down the road. Finally, I think it was the third night. The end of the third day, because we've already been up there for 3 nights. It's like a 5-day trip out there. So I run into places, I don't know, Reno or Salt Lake City or something. "How much is a one-way ticket?" And the guy said, he says, "Why do you care? You just got off the train. You got a ticket." I said, "Never mind. How much is a one-way ticket, coach?" And he said, like 23 or whatever it was. I had, "Give me a one-way ticket to San Francisco." I bought one. Back in the upper berth. "Mary Jane, hallelujah. You're free again. The porter can make up my bunk, and away we go." So she only her only baggage was the clothes that she had on, which she had taken off at the start of the trip, and there's a little hammock up on the top where you can put your clothes. So now she gets up, washes her face, gets dressed, and goes up in the coach section. He makes up my bed. I'm standing there while he's making. He's shaking these sheets, and breadcrumbs fall all over. He turns to me and he said, "Man, it's a little gamey, ain't it?" A little gamey is right. So anyway, she goes up in the coach and she sits beside a lady who had 3 little kids with her. And Mary Jane just loved children. She sits beside this lady and she starts helping her with the kids, taking them for walks down the aisle, and all this kind of stuff. And they developed a friendship. And I'd visit up there with them because now I can go up in the coach and talk to her and so forth. So I went up and Mary Jane introduces me to this lady and said, "She is wonderful." And she says they have a little a little bedroom built over their garage that they rent to Navy people that are coming through San Francisco. And she said, "We can rent that when we get to San Francisco unless her husband has already rented it to somebody else." So we get to San Francisco and her husband meets us with a car, and the lady asked him if the bedroom was available, and he said, "Yeah, they moved out yesterday." She says, "Great, I've got the people that are moving in." He said, "Well, I promised this." I said, "I don't care who you promised to. This couple is moving in this place." So we get in the car with them, go home with them. We go in this little bedroom that they had built over their garage, and that was our place. 85 Reno Street, I think it was. Something like 85 something in San Francisco. So every morning I would go down and report into the Navy, waiting for my transportation to Guadalcanal. And when there was no transportation, of course, then I had the rest of the day off. So about the 4th or 5th day this had happened, when I had the rest of the day off, I'd go back to the little bedroom and we'd go sightseeing in San Francisco. So about the 4th or 5th day I went back. I said, "Okay, sweetheart, what are we going to do today?" She said, "We're getting married." I said, "What do you mean getting married? We're already married." "Well," she said, "that was a civil ceremony." She said, "I know you Catholic boys. You don't think you're married unless you're married in the church." But she said, "Every morning when you went down to Navy headquarters, I went over to the cathedral and I took instructions." And she said, "Yesterday I became a Catholic, and today we're getting married at 11 o'clock in the Catholic Church." She says, "You're not going to Guadalcanal thinking you're not married." So we went over to the cathedral, got married. So we were married on the East Coast by a civilian authority in Norfolk, Virginia, and on the West Coast by a Catholic priest at the cathedral. I forget what the name of it was. So maybe 2 days after we were married in San Francisco, I get down and they got the transportation for me. I'm leaving that afternoon at such and such. So I left on a merchant ship, unescorted, all alone, heading for Guadalcanal. 30-day trip in seas that are controlled by the Japanese submarines, and we're all alone. So the first night I'm there, I'm talking to one of the chiefs, and I said, "What do you got to work on here for 30 days?" I said, the chiefs run the Navy. I don't care, merchant marine, Navy, the chiefs are the guys that run the thing. I said, "What do you do around here now for 30 days?" "Oh," he said, "I've got it made." He said, "Meet me tonight at midnight at such and such a place on the ship." He said, "I'll show you what I mean." So midnight I'm there, and he said, "Follow me." We go up to a place. He unlocks one of the holes, full of beer. Got to be 40,000 cases of beer in there. He had 2 fire buckets. He said, "Here's your fire bucket and here's mine." I said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "Just watch me." He takes his knife and cuts the end out of one of the cartons of beer, reaches in and fills his fire bucket with beer, goes to another carton, cuts it open, fills my bucket with beer. Next night we go back down to the same place, stick the empties back into the boxes that we had cut open, go to the next place, cut them open, take the beer. 30 days, he and I, every day drank a fire bucket full of beer on the way to Guadalcanal. So I got to Guadalcanal, and our squadron was in. I joined the first Fletcher-class destroyer squadron that was in the war. It was a 2,100 ton squadron. All the other destroyers were 1,750 tons and smaller, 1,600 tons. But we were the newest and the fastest squadron of destroyers in the Pacific. We were faster and better armed than anything the Japs had, and faster and better than anything that we had that weren't 2,100 ton squadrons. And they were still building they built a lot of, subsequently, they built a lot of 2,100 ton destroyers. But we were the first squadron out there. Anyway, we get to Guadalcanal about noon. We unload. I find the flagship. I was assigned to the staff, which was good duty. I was not ship's complement. I was with the staff. There were 5 of us on the staff. The Commodore, who ran the entire squadron, and myself and 3 other guys. I joined the squadron. I went on board the Nicholas. 4 o'clock, we're underway. I said, Commodore, where are we going? What are we going to do tonight? He said, kill Japs. I said, what? He said, you know the motto of this squadron, don't you? I said, what is it? He said, our motto is kill Japs, kill Japs, kill more Japs. He said, we're going hunting. So it turns out that the slot is a body of water between the various islands of the New Hebrides, Guadalcanal being one of them. And the Japs were attempting to reinforce Guadalcanal. We had already landed the Marines. The Marines told the Navy they could handle the ones that were there. Just don't let any more of them get in on us. So every night we patrolled those straits. Our orders were to sink anything that moved. Our own submarines knew where we were, and that would be the only thing that was up there because there were no other ships out there. So our orders were literally, anything that moves on the radar scope that we see it, sink it. So the first night we went up there, about 10 o'clock, we come into a half a dozen smaller ships that were relatively unarmed, but they were obviously Japanese troop ships. And we went in there and sunk every damn one of them. We had about 500 Japs in the water. We went alongside one, tried to pick him up, and they wouldn't have anything to do with it. They weren't going to be picked up. They weren't going to become prisoners. So the Commodore lined up we had 8 destroyers. He lined us up across here, 500 yards between us. We started through where all these Japs were in the water, doing 30 knots, went right straight through them. I said to the Commodore, I said, what do you call this? He said, we call this making Japanese soup. He says, we're going to kill every one of these babies that are in here. And I think we did, because they wouldn't come aboard. We weren't going to wait till daylight when their fleet was patrolling down there. So that was my introduction to the first night at Guadalcanal. From then on, this is a long one. You want to cut it off? This is the 12. The light is going on. I'll continue to talk. Anyway.
I'll just wait till it's done.
Our squadron, at one time we had 9 destroyers in our squadron. 8 originally, and then we got another. So we had 9 in our squadron. Only 3 of us came back undamaged. All the rest of them were either sunk or damaged during the war. The closest we came to being hit was we had our radar knocked off the top of our mast by a kamikaze plane. He was diving on us and missed us and came in. But we patrolled all through New Hebrides, all the islands. And when I left the squadron, we had been in 13 major engagements between Guadalcanal and Okinawa. And our flagship, the Nicholas, became the most highly decorated fighting vessel in the history of the United States Navy. And our squadron became the most highly decorated destroyer squadron in World War II. We were in on everything. I've got all these books over here about our squadron that it's unbelievable what was accomplished by that squadron. And one of the things I liked in there, one of the books I read, Admiral Halsey, who was in charge of our squadron most of the time, said, I can always tell a destroyer officer by the swagger in his walk. He said, they are the cream of the Navy, and we were. I mean, we saw more action than anything else. So, I came back after 2 years. I saw our oldest daughter for the first time when she was like 2 years old. And I had 30 days delay before I picked up my next orders. I picked up my orders, proceed and report first available transportation, Okinawa. So I called, my former commanding officer had then gone to Bureau of Personnel in Washington. And I called him and I said, what is this? I've been out there 2 years, I come back 30 days, and I'm going right back out. I said, every bar I've walked into, the guys have seen my ribbons and they say, boy, I'd like to get out there and get at those guys. I said, how about letting some of them get out there and get at those guys? He said, Jack, that's not the problem. He said, this is top secret. Don't repeat it under any circumstances. He said, we have lost 65 destroyers at Okinawa to the kamikazes. But he said, we don't want them to know how much damage they're doing to it. He said, the thing in the Navy at this point is destroyer officers. We need destroyer officers the worst way at Okinawa. He said, there's not much I can do for you. No, wait a minute. He said, I'll tell you what I'll do. He said, I'll change your orders to give you 2 weeks in Biloxi, Mississippi at a training school down there. Then at the end of 2 weeks, you get back out to San Francisco and get your ass to Okinawa. Is that fair enough? Well, I said, if that's the best you can do, I'll do it. So I took Mary Jane with me and went, I said, what do you want me to do in Biloxi? Well, he said, I'll give you an 8 to 9 class. What do you want me to teach? Tell them how tough it is out there. Tell them war stories at 8 to 9 in the morning, and then you got the rest of the day off. So we go to Biloxi. We check in the hotel there on Saturday afternoon. I have to report for duty on Monday morning. We're sitting in the dining room having dinner. Who walks in but a fraternity brother of mine and his wife, Sherry Cathall. I yell at him. He can, what are you doing here? Well, I said, I'm stationed out at the Navy. Well, he said, I'm over here at such and such a field. He said, God, we got a bunch of fraternity brothers over there. He said, there are about 10,000 officers over there, pilots. He said, but he said, we've all been to Europe and we're back and we're training to go back again to Japan or wherever. So he said, you know this? He said, we could have one hell of a party here this weekend. And I said, hell, the weekends? No, he said, this town is dry. Biloxi's dry. He said, the only place we can get booze is out at the officers' club. And he said, I'll call the guys right away. I'll start calling. We'll get them over here starting tonight. What's your room number and so forth, blah, 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 blah. And he said, we'll party till Sunday night. You don't have to report in till Monday morning. We'll keep right on party. I said, okay. So he called. Max Wilson was out there. Cathall was out there. 2 or 3 of the other guys were out there. So I said, well, all right, start getting into my room. By this time, it's like 6 o'clock at night. I said, the party will start tonight. You guys be here. He said, we'll be here, and we'll have the booze. So I go to the bellman, and I said, I'd like to have a fire bucket full of ice sent to this room every hour on the hour till I stop you. But we're going to start a big party up there. He said, yeah, the boss. So I get up there, and about this time, the guys start coming in. They're all bringing a case of whiskey with them. I think there were 3 couples, so there were 4 couples of us in this room. We got like 4 cases of whiskey. We got this guy bringing a fire bucket full of ice every hour on the hour, and the party started all night Saturday night, all morning, Sunday morning. One of the guys, and this is a terrible story, one of the guys was almost drowned during that party. He got sick and he was on the floor with his head in the commode, vomiting. Cathall, who had played end at Nebraska, was about 6'3" or 6'4", probably weighed 200 pounds, drunk, staggered into the bathroom, slammed the lid down on the back of this guy's head, sat down on the pot, and here's this guy with his head down in the commode, Cathall sitting on top of it. Cathall finally sees his feet kicking out there and realizes what the situation is, so he gets up and lets the guy up. Anyway, it was some kind of a party. And I remember, one thing I remember was this fire bucket of ice. I forgot to tell the guy to stop bringing it every hour on the hour. We had a bathtub full of ice before the party. So we had this wonderful party in Biloxi, Mississippi. I've never been there since, and it's probably just as well. But it's very close to where Teresa, John's first wife, lived, and it's a lovely area down there. It was highly damaged, of course, by Katrina. It's become a big gambling center and so forth. But we finished the party Sunday night. That party lasted from about 5 o'clock Saturday afternoon till about 7 or 8 o'clock Sunday evening. And it was a party to end all parties. So I went to I checked in Monday morning at the Naval Air Station in Biloxi, and I had a class that lasted 1 hour, 8 to 9, and I told them war stories, and I told them what I thought they ought to be doing and so forth, and it apparently was satisfactory because it was well attended. But of course it was mandated, so you knew you were going to get a pretty good attendance because the guys had to come. End of 2 weeks, we're off. We go to Columbus, Ohio. Mary Jane gets off from Columbus, Ohio, and the intention was to go to school. No, that's not right. She didn't get off in Columbus, Ohio. We went. I can't remember whether she went back to San Francisco. No, she didn't. She went to Columbus, Ohio, because I went back to San Francisco alone. And this was late July of 1945. And I was waiting for transportation to Okinawa. And President Truman dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima one day, and the following day he dropped another one, and that was the end of the war, and that was the end of Japan. And I called my former commanding officer in Washington, D.C., and I acquainted him with the fact that it was ridiculous for me to complete those orders because it would take me 30 days by ship to get back to Okinawa. The war was over. If the reason for me going to Okinawa was because they needed destroyer officers and the kamikazes were running rampant and that matter had been concluded, it was dumb for me to go 30 days out and then 30 days back on the ship. So he agreed with me, but I had to make one concession. He knew that I was going to start law school at Ohio State on the 2nd of January 1946. And he said that I had enough points to get out, of course, out of the Navy when the war was over. And he said if I would go down to Norfolk, Virginia, to the Navy base in Norfolk, and stay until the latter part of November, it would be a great favor to him, and he would cancel my orders to Okinawa. So we made a deal. He canceled my orders to Okinawa, and I agreed to go back to Norfolk, Virginia, where I became the assistant to the training officer of the entire base, and my only job was signing discharge papers for the guys getting out of the Navy, and they were swarming through there by the thousands, and I had writer's cramp at the end of every day signing the discharge papers. But I stayed down there. Mary Jane stayed in Columbus. By this time, of course, our daughter was born, and she used to drive back and forth occasionally. And she had a baby basket she put Bunny in the back seat, and they had some kind of a strap they wrapped around it so it wouldn't fall off the back seat. And she'd drive alone from Ohio to Norfolk on the occasional weekend. Finally, it becomes the latter part of November, and I'm out of the Navy. I go to Zanesville, Ohio, where Mary Jane had been living with her father. Her mother had passed away on VJ Day. I was in San Francisco, and of course I didn't have time to get home for the funeral. and Mary Jane and the family was still in mourning by the time I got home. But we spent December of 1945 living with Colonel Brannon, who was living alone at that time in this big house in Zanesville, Ohio. He also made an agreement with me that we would stay with him and I would go to law school and drive back and forth from Zanesville to Columbus, Ohio. It was a 60-mile drive one way, so I'd be driving 120 miles a day. And we tried to do it. I did it in the fall. He was in charge of the Ohio National Guard at the time, and they had a big armory in Columbus. And quite often I would spend 2 or 3 nights in the armory on a folding bed rather than drive back to Zanesville because of the distance and because of the time or because of the weather. But it became evident through that winter. At one point I was almost killed during the drive. I was traveling on Highway 40 between Zanesville and Columbus, and it was a very icy day, and I was coming up over the top of a hill, and a truck was coming from the other direction, and suddenly realized that he was going too fast, and he hit his brakes, and the semi started to jackknife. And it was jackknifing across the road in front of me when I was about 50 yards from the truck, and I was trying to slow down, but the braking system was not working on the sheer ice, and the truck was sliding, and I thought, boy, that truck semi is going to whack, is going to be crossways in the road in front of me as I get there. And fortunately, as I got there, it just missed me very closely, and I got by it safely, and the truck, of course, was wrecked in the ditch that I kept on going to because I had classes that morning to law school. And when I reiterated the story to Mary Jane after getting back to Zanesville, she said, "That does it. We cannot live in Zanesville and go to law school. It's just impossible. The distance is impossible. The expense was great. The car we had was a 1939 Chevrolet that belonged to Colonel Brannon, and it was such a mess that I was in a little shopping center in Zanesville one Saturday and driving slowly looking for a parking place, and some guy backed out and backed into the side of the car. I stopped the car and got out, and of course he got out, and the side of the car that he had backed into was badly rusted from the front fender back to the back fender, and he looks at that car and he said, "My God, I wasn't traveling 3 miles an hour. I can't believe the damage I've done to that car." He wiped out one side of the car because the rust just was so bad that the car, everything fell off. But anyway, housing was very difficult to obtain. It was very difficult to find any place because all during the war there was a moratorium on building homes, and they hadn't built any new homes. And we looked and looked for a place to live in Columbus and couldn't find a place. And finally Mary Jane learned of a contractor who was building homes that could be sold only to veterans. And we found they were very nice little homes made of brick and the traditional little square house, but had an unfinished upstairs. And Mary Jane heard about them, and I went to 1408 Doughton Avenue in Columbus and talked to the contractor, and the houses were selling for $8,000. The government price was $8,000. So I told him that I'd like to buy one, and he said, "I'm sorry, but they're all sold." And I said, "Boy, we need a house so bad." And I explained my circumstances to him. And he said, "Well, I've sold one of these to my foreman. He has the rights to buy this house." And he said, "Maybe you can buy the rights from him." Well, it was obviously a ploy on their part to get more than the $8,000 that the government had paid, because if you had to buy the right to buy the house from the foreman, you knew that they were getting at you. And I said, "Well, what will that cost me?" And he said, $200. And I said, "Fine, I'll give him a check right now." And he said, "No, he won't take a check, he wants cash." So I had to go to the bank and get $200 in cash and go through with this deal in order to get this house. And it was very fortunate we did. we moved up with the help of a number of our friends from Zanesville in a rented truck. Colonel Brannon loaned us furniture that he had, and we moved in, and I'll never forget the day he moved in. My friend Joe Bennett, who drove the rental truck, had driven a tank in World War II, and he drove a car like he drove the tank, and he got to 1408 Dayton Avenue on a rainy day, and they had just laid the front yard with new sod, and so we wouldn't have to carry the furniture from the curb into the house. He decided to back up to the front door, and he backed up to the front door and got stuck in the mud in the front yard and tore all our sod out. But that was just one of many of our interesting situations as we moved in there. So I went to law school, and it was a very difficult experience for me from the standpoint of the fact that I'd been out of school for about 5 years, and I was raising a family, and I was working full-time for the Attorney General. Colonel Brannon was a big dog in the Ohio Republican Party, and Fred Johnson was the state Republican chairman. And Fred told me, I called Fred to see about getting a job. And he said, yes, Jack, I can get you a job in the Attorney General's office. But he said, if I do, I want you to do me a favor. He said, I want you to start an organization, a Republican organization in the law school of the Ohio State. And he said, we'll call it the War Veterans Republican Club. And he said, come down to my office and I'll give you $250 in cash for expenses, and you go up there and organize the war veterans to become Republicans. So I did, and one of the people that I recruited was a fellow by the name of Bill Saxby, who was experiencing the same thing that I had driving back and forth to law school, only he lived in Mechanicsburg, Ohio, and he was driving back and forth to law school. Anyway, we got the War Veterans Republican Club started at Ohio State. And our success was evident in the career of Bill Saxby. We ran Bill Saxby for state legislature and got him elected from Mechanicsburg. And from the state legislature, as a legislator, he then became a state senator. And from state senator, he ran for Attorney General of Ohio and was elected Attorney General in Ohio. He then ran for United States Senator from Ohio and was elected the United States Senator. And he then became the ambassador to India and had a very, very successful career, made literally millions of dollars by accepting a questionable job with the AFL-UAW union and working for them as their chief main attorney. But we had a lot of great experiences. I was the first president of the War Veterans Republican Club at Ohio State, and we did a lot of other things. I had a very interesting job with the Attorney General. I worked only on the weekends. I went to work Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock after my last class, and my job was proofreading the Attorney General's opinions. The opinions that had been rendered by the Attorney General that week, I read over the weekend. And I was paid so much an hour, and it took me about 40 hours over the weekend, working about 15 hours a day from Friday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon until Sunday about 8 o'clock at night to proofread all the Attorney General's opinions so they could be printed and disseminated to all the lawyers and judges and so forth in Ohio on Monday. But it was a good job, and I was working there at a time when a fellow by the name of Frank Gates was starting an organization in Columbus, representing employers before the bureaus of workers' compensation, unemployment compensation, and other federal and state agencies pertaining to employment, Fair Employment Act. And actually our business got better every time the government passed another law that required employers to perform additional services with respect to their employees. We got another area of business with them. Frank Gates called the Attorney General, who was a good friend of his, and asked if he had anybody over there that might like to come with him in the initial phases of his business. And the Attorney General recommended me, and I went over and interviewed. And I'll never forget the interview. We were talking, and he said, how much does it cost you to live? And I said, well, I'm not sure. I'm getting $65 a month from the Veterans Administration, and I'm making whatever it was. It didn't amount to that much from the Attorney General. And he said, well, you go home, and you and Mrs. Spittler sit down and figure how much it's costing you to get along, your house payments and so forth. I didn't have a car yet at that time. So that night we sat down at the kitchen table and put down the numbers. I went back and told him that it would take me at least $300 to come with him, $300 a month, and he said, you're hired. I think if I'd have said $450, I might have been hired, and I was always sorry that I didn't. But I went to work for him for $300 a month, and I really had the run of the place to do what I wanted to run my part of the business the way I wanted to. And I could come and go as I wanted to and had complete freedom in most everything. I had good vacation policy. He had a good bonus policy, and I was sorry at various times that I had gone to work for them, because that job really never tested my full capabilities, and I think I would have gone much farther and done much better, possibly going with a law firm. However, I became very involved with two boys growing up, and I always got home for their baseball games at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I wasn't working 8 to 5, I was working about 7:30 till 4, and I was coaching their baseball teams, and I was I was president of the PTA, and I became very involved in community affairs. And one of our projects, Bob Patton was co-chairman. He and I built the football stadium, raised the money to build the football stadium at Upper Arlington High School, and the stadium was completely paid for by private subscription. Bob Patton was a fabulous person, a very good friend of mine. Unfortunately, on the day that his son was to be married, Bob was going to be the best man at First Community Church. It came time for the wedding at First Community Church, and Bob wasn't there. They called his home, and no one answered. They went to his home to find out what the problem was, and he had dropped dead on the kitchen floor on the day that his son was to be married. And of course, that then presented the situation with the family as to whether they would go through with the wedding, and Bucky, who was Bob's son, getting married, decided that Bob would want him to be married. So in spite of Bob's death, that afternoon they went ahead and got themselves married. We took a number of family trips, some of which were quite interesting. I remember one in particular. We were going to the West Coast for 30 days. We were going to the West Coast and start at Los Angeles and go up to Seattle, where there was a World's Fair. We were going to take the southern route through Texas and Arizona to get to Los Angeles to go to Disney, and then we were going from Disney and Los Angeles up to Seattle to the World's Fair, and then come back the northern route through Wyoming, South Dakota, and so forth. My Aunt Babe, my mother's sister, had moved to Chandler, Arizona, which was a suburb of Phoenix. We hadn't seen her for a number of years, and we'd made arrangements to stay with her one night. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little. We had intended, of course, to stay at motels. One night I was coming home from work, and I went by a place that was selling trailers, camping trailers and so forth. I stopped in, and I really liked a kind of camping trailer that popped open. You drug it behind the car. It was really low slung, and you could see back through your rearview mirror right over the top of it. But when you stopped, you unfolded the thing, and it folded out so that 6 people could sleep in, 2 on each side in bunks, and 2 on the floor. Well, there were 5 of us at the time, and I decided that would be a great experience with this camping trailer. So I went home and told Mary Jane about it, and she said, no, I'm not going to do that. We won't have any showers. We won't have any conveniences. We're not going to camp out all the way to the West Coast. Well, I said, come down and look at the trailer. So she goes down and looks at the trailer, and she said, well, I'll make a deal. She said, every other day, every other night we'll spend in a motel. We'll stay one night in the camper and then one night in the motel. So we bought the camping trailer. We filled it up that day, that night we filled it up with canned goods and put sheets in and pillows and so forth. The next day we took off. We camped the first night in Indianapolis on a river. And I remember that it just rained cats and dogs in the middle of the night. Mary Jane woke me up and said, "You've got to move this trailer. The river's going to flood and cut us in, or the trailer's going to fall into the river." She said, "We got to move this trailer." I got up at 2 o'clock in the morning, went out naked in the pouring down rain and maneuvered that dumb trailer out of the road because she thought that the side of the riverbank was going to collapse and we were going to fall in the river. And she could see our camping trailer floating down the river. The next night we were supposed to stay in the motel, but we drove so late that we couldn't find a motel, so we camped out, and we camped out in a cemetery. And again we had a big rainstorm, and the kids could see the tombstones in the cemetery, and every once in a while they'd wake up and holler, "There's a ghost floating around." They were seeing ghosts floating around the cemetery. Anyway, make a long story short, we never stayed in a motel that first night because the camping facilities all the way out and back were just absolutely incredible. They had places where you could hook up to, we had an extension cord with a little light bulb hanging in the middle of it, and we had an electric plate to cook on and so forth. But it turned out to be an incredible, absolutely incredible trip. But we stopped in Chandler, Arizona to spend the night with Aunt Babe. The next morning we got up, and Jimmy, our youngest, who was then about 7 or 8 years old, said to Aunt Babe, "Why don't you go with us, Aunt Babe?" And I about swallowed my tongue because we were already crowded. And Aunt Babe said, "Well, that's wonderful. I think I will." And I said, No, we've got to go. We're running late already. We've got to get out of here." She said, "I can be packed in 5 minutes." And she went in the bedroom and in less than 5 minutes came out with her suitcase. And I suspect to this day that she had her suitcase packed a couple days before we got there and just hoped that somebody would say, "Aunt Babe, why don't you go with us?" Anyway, she piles in the car. Now we got 3 kids, Mary Jane and myself, and Aunt Babe. So it was getting pretty crowded, and of course with that sleeping in that trailer, it now became necessary for 2 people to sleep in the station wagon and to get Aunt Babe in the trailer. Anyway, we went to Los Angeles, and we went across the Mojave Desert on the way to Los Angeles, and Cozy had just a couple of weeks before had bought a little lizard at a circus. It had a little chain on it, and she rode around with that little lizard on her shoulder. And it was we didn't have air conditioning in the car, and going across that desert, it was so hot that the little lizard started to pant, and pretty soon he rolled over dead. That's how hot it was going across the desert. So now I said, "Cozy, we got to throw that lizard out of the door." "No," she said, "I'm not going to throw it out. I'm going to bury it at Disney. He would like to be buried at Disney. I know that little lizard." She said, "We'll find a place at Disney when we get there." So we got to Disneyland. The first thing she did when we got into Disney was found a little corner and dug a little hole and buried her lizard. So she has probably the distinction of being the only person in the world that has a lizard buried at Disney in Los Angeles. But one of the interesting things was we found a place to park at a filling station right across from Disney. We pulled in there for gas, and I asked the guy if he knew of a place where we could park this trailer. And he says, "As a matter of fact, I've got a little spot back there behind the filling station." And he said, "For $5 a day, I'll let you park and plug in my electricity," and so forth. So we pulled back, and it was a space about maybe 4 by 8, but the trailer just fit in there fine, and we pulled in there and parked. And we stayed at Disney, I think, for 4 days, and we were paying $5 a day. So it cost us $20 to stay at Disney. And unknowing to us, my brother was visiting Disney at the same time. He and his wife and family were staying in the Disney hotel at Disneyland. He was paying $125 a day, and we were staying across the street from him for $5 a day. We always laughed about that. Then we went north and to Seattle, and then came back through Yellowstone Park. And one night we're in Yellowstone Park, and we had a big fire built, and a number of other campers were around this fire also, and we were talking. We had folding chairs. And here comes a big black bear down the path. And everybody started to run and get in their car and lock the door, the car door and so forth. he was knocking over garbage pails and eating out whatever he could find in there. And he kept right on coming to where we were. And we all ran and got in our car and looked around, and Aunt Babe was still sitting at the fire in a folding chair. And we hollered, "Hey, better get in the car, better get in the car, Aunt Babe." She says, "There's no damn bear going to drive me away from my campfire." And with that, she picked up a stick that was burning at one end and it was about 3 feet long. She picked it up in her hand and waved it a couple of times as the bear got up to about 10 feet from her. And the old bear reared up on his hind legs and roared and took a big detour around her. And about 50 other people who were in their cars all gave her a big cheer and a clap. And they, "Bravo, bravo." She sat there and drove that bear off. But that was kind of interesting because that was the spirit of Aunt Babe. She was as we used to say out west, a tough old boot. And we get to, finally we end up, end of the 30 days, we get to Columbus. She's still with us. She's going to fly back to Phoenix. So she decided that she'd spend a week or so with us. Well, Cozy was dating a young fella that had a motorcycle. He was about 17 years old. And the first or second day she's there, she and I are sitting on the front porch, and he pulls up in his motorcycle and comes up and said, "Aunt Babe, what do you think of my new motorcycle?" She said, "It's just beautiful. I've always wanted to ride on a motorcycle." He said, "Get on the back and we'll go." At that time, she was 72 years old. She said, "Just a minute." She goes inside, gets a bandana handkerchief, ties it around her head, puts a bow under her chin, goes out. He helps her straddle the rear seat on that motorcycle. He turns that thing around, and they went roaring out of our driveway at 2435 Coventry Road, and down the road they go. They came back in about half an hour. He helps her off the motorcycle. I said, "What'd you think, Aunt Babe?" She said, "One of the most exhilarating experiences I've ever had in my life. I'm sure glad to get an opportunity to ride on a motorcycle." Well, it came, she was with us about 2 weeks, and it came the day that she was to go to the airport in the afternoon, catch a plane to Arizona. That morning, she was going down in the basement to get some clothes that was in the dryer or whatever, and she fell, broke her ankle. We had the doctor come, and he patched her up. Now she's got to stay another 2 weeks with us while her ankle healed up enough so she could get to the airport. But it was a long and interesting visit, and it was certainly worth it because she left everything she had to my brother and myself equally, and it was she was a wonderful gal, just absolutely super gal. Another highlight of our growing up on Coventry Road when I was practicing law there was we took a 30-day trip to Europe, and again Bunny wasn't with us because she was married, but we went to something like 15 or 16 different countries in this 30-day period. And it got to the point, and there was a film crew with us filming the thing. We had to sign a release to let them, so we were in this moving picture anyway, as it turned out. I never did see the moving picture, but the name of the picture was, "It's Tuesday, It Must Be Belgium." And that was about right. On Tuesday we'd be in Belgium, on Wednesday we'd be in France, and it was interesting. Anyway, we get to Rome, and the guide told Cozy, who was then, I guess, about 16 years old, told Cozy, he said, "Now, don't get out in front. Just stay back here with us because the Italians, well, it wasn't Rome, it was in Italy. He said, the Italians have, Italian men go around pinching girls on the bottom. And he said, especially young girls and especially Americans, so don't get out too far." Well, there was another little girl in our group that was about the same age as Cozy, and they went off skipping, yeah, you know. About 30 minutes later, they came running back as fast as, "Some Italian pinched me on the bottom." And they got pinched, and that was what they remember, I guess, about going to Italy. But we had a number of very interesting trips.